Ethan Carter's farm had always been more than a piece of land. It was a legacy. Nestled in the heart of rolling countryside near Oakwood, the farm was a living testament to decades of hard work, tradition, and independence. Every morning, as the sun stretched its golden rays over weathered barns and wide-open pastures, Ethan would rise to tend to his chickens, cattle, and crops. Among the treasures of his homestead were his prized flock of hens, renowned not only for their robust health, but also for the exceptional eggs they laid. Eggs that Ethan used to create his famous homemade pickles and preserves, cherished by the entire local community. A former military man turned dedicated rancher, Ethan took immense pride in every aspect of his property. He valued the self-sufficiency of rural life, the soft clucking of hens, the rhythmic scratching in the dirt, and the satisfaction of watching nature provide its bounty. His chickens were his heartbeat, their eggs a symbol of both sustenance and tradition, passed down from his parents and grandparents. For Ethan, the farm was his sanctuary, a haven where every corner held memories and every creature played its part in the cycle of life. However, not everyone in the community appreciated the organic charm of Ethan's homestead. Lately, rumors had begun to spread of an overreaching homeowners association, HOA, that sought to impose a sterile uniformity on even the most cherished properties. At the center of this bureaucratic crusade was Kerren Miller, the self-appointed queen of the HOA. Always seen in impeccably pressed skirts, polished shoes, and clutching her clipboard as though it were a scepter, Kerren prided herself on enforcing a rigid set of standards. To her, every property, no matter how steeped in history and character, had to conform to a narrow, modern vision of order. The first spark of conflict came on a sweltering summer afternoon. As Ethan was checking on his prized egg-laying hens in the chicken coop, he noticed a small group of well-dressed individuals wandering through his property. At the head of the group was none other than Kerren herself, her eyes scanning the grounds with an air of self-importance. Before Ethan could call out, he saw her near the coop. With a haughty smile, she reached over and, to his horror, began rummaging in the nest boxes, taking several of his fresh chicken eggs right off the hens' nesting boxes. "Ethan, I'm here to ensure that all residents adhere to our community standards," Kerren announced sharply as she continued her invasive inspection. "I've noticed that you're not properly securing your eggs. This negligence affects the neighborhood's overall quality and must be corrected immediately." Ethan's heart pounded in disbelief. His chicken eggs weren't just a source of income. They were a symbol of the care and tradition that defined his farm. "Kerren, my property is my own," he retorted, stepping forward. "My chickens lay these eggs naturally, and I harvest them with care. I don't need you or the HOA coming onto my land and taking what isn't yours." A hush fell over the small crowd of neighbors who had gathered discreetly to watch. Kerren, unfazed, held up a freshly printed final warning notice. "The rules apply to everyone, Ethan. Your failure to secure your eggs is a violation of our community guidelines. If you do not rectify this immediately, further action will be taken." That confrontation marked the beginning of a bitter battle. For Ethan, Kerren's intrusion wasn't simply about a few stolen eggs. It was about an arrogant imposition on his way of life. His farm was his legacy, built on generations of hard work and nurtured by the natural rhythms of the land. Now his sacred routines were being disrupted by an entitled bureaucrat who believed that conformity mattered more than tradition. As the day wore on and the sun began to set behind the fields, Ethan sat on his creaking porch, the final warning clutched tightly in his calloused hand. The peaceful sounds of the countryside, clucks from the coop, the gentle rustle of the wind through the corn, now felt invaded by the specter of authority. Determined not to let Kerren's petty rules erode the very soul of his farm, he vowed that he would defend his property and his legacy at any cost. The battle lines were drawn. A man who lived in harmony with his land versus an overreaching enforcer intent on imposing her vision by force. The morning after that shocking intrusion, Ethan awoke to find another unwelcome surprise. An official envelope, bearing the HOA's seal and a stern legal tone, was taped to his farmhouse door. With a mix of anger and disbelief, he opened it to reveal a fine of $750 for improper management of community assets, a thinly veiled reference to the eggs that Kerren had pilfered. The notice was heavy with legalese and veiled threats, making it abundantly clear that the HOA intended to enforce its rules at all costs. Before Ethan could process the fine, he stepped outside to find Kerren waiting near the fence, her posture rigid and her expression smug. "Good morning, Ethan," she said crisply. "I trust you've read the notice. Our community standards apply to every property, and yours must be brought into compliance immediately." Ethan's jaw clenched as he replied, "Kerren, my chickens lay these eggs naturally. I take care of my animals, and I manage my farm as my family always has. Your fine is nothing more than an attempt to bully me into submission." His voice was calm yet resolute, a firm declaration of his right to run his property without interference. Kerren's eyes narrowed, and she retorted in a tone that brooked no argument. "It is my duty to ensure that all properties adhere to our guidelines. Noncompliance will result in further fines and actions." With that, she turned and strode away, leaving Ethan stewing over the unjust penalty. Later that morning, as Ethan inspected the boundaries of his property, he noticed a nondescript van parked near his coop. Two inspectors, dressed in uniform and armed with clipboards, stepped out and began a meticulous inspection of his chicken run and nesting boxes. They measured distances, took photographs, and made notes as if his humble setup were a matter of public record. Ethan's loyal dogs barked at the intruders, adding to the tension that had now gripped his farm. Determined not to be intimidated, Ethan began documenting every detail of the inspection. He snapped photos of the inspectors at work, recorded snippets of their conversations on his phone, and jotted down notes in a well-worn notebook. Each detail was a silent protest, a refusal to allow his home to be violated by bureaucratic overreach. That afternoon, in the quiet solitude of his barn's office, Ethan compiled all the evidence into a detailed dossier. He drafted a formal complaint to the local zoning office, citing long-standing agricultural exemptions and property rights that protected him from such arbitrary interference. His complaint wasn't just a legal challenge. It was a declaration that his farm, the heart of his family's legacy, would not be dictated by the whims of an entitled HOA. Word of the fine and the intrusive inspection spread quickly through Cedar Valley. At local feed stores and community gatherings, neighbors whispered about similar experiences and began to question the fairness of Kerren's actions. Slowly, a sense of solidarity began to form among property owners who felt that their rights were being trampled in the name of order. As dusk fell and the first stars appeared, Kerren returned to the ranch. Under the soft glow of a porch light, she delivered an ultimatum. "Ethan, you have 48 hours to rectify this situation and secure your property properly, or face additional fines and further action." Her tone was unyielding, leaving no room for negotiation. Ethan's reply was measured and firm. "I will continue to manage my farm the way I always have. My chickens, my eggs, and my way of life are not for you to dictate." With that, he closed the door behind him, his resolve hardened for the battle ahead. In the days following Kerren's ultimatum, the conflict at Ethan's farm escalated well beyond fines and inspections. What started as a single act of theft, the pilfering of his precious chicken eggs, had blossomed into a full-scale campaign of intimidation by the HOA. Neighbors began to murmur that Kerren not only trespassed on private property, but sometimes even took things without permission. Rumors swirled that she'd been caught on camera on other properties, and some even claimed she tried to procure eggs from other farms for her own misguided notion of community sharing. One overcast afternoon, while Ethan was repairing a section of his chicken coop fence, his longtime friend and neighbor, Larry, pulled up beside him. "Ethan," Larry said in a hushed tone, "you're not the only one being harassed. I've heard that Kerren's been swiping eggs from several farms and even swapping them with other residents to bolster her community fund. People are fed up, and there's talk that the money from those fines is vanishing into thin air for her personal use." Larry's words struck a nerve. The idea that Kerren was exploiting her position for personal gain, and worse, taking food off the table of hardworking farmers, fueled Ethan's sense of injustice. Determined to get to the bottom of it, Ethan began a covert investigation into the HOA's operations. He made discreet trips to the county clerk's office to pore over financial records, attended board meetings incognito, and even recorded murmured conversations among disgruntled neighbors. Every scrap of evidence pointed to a disturbing pattern. Kerren's actions were not about maintaining standards. They were about control and profit. Late one rainy night, as thunder rumbled over Cedar Valley, Ethan sat in the dim light of his barn office, reviewing photocopies of ledger entries and anonymous notes. He compiled a comprehensive dossier detailing the irregularities in the HOA's finances, including mysterious deductions and unexplained transfers. With each piece of evidence, his determination grew. This wasn't an isolated incident. It was a systematic abuse of power that needed to be exposed. Word of Ethan's investigation began to circulate quietly. At a secret meeting in the back room of a local feed store, several frustrated property owners recounted their own stories of arbitrary fines and invasive inspections. An elderly farmer tearfully described how a minor deviation in his chicken coop design had resulted in a crippling fine, while another neighbor admitted he'd been coerced into paying voluntary contributions that never reached any communal improvement fund. The collective outrage resonated deeply, and Ethan's dossier became a beacon of hope for those determined to fight back. In response, Ethan upgraded his security system, installing additional cameras around the coop and throughout the property. His faithful dogs were always on alert, their barks a constant reminder of his determination to protect his home. Every instance of trespassing and every unauthorized inspection was captured in meticulous detail. His phone and notebook quickly filled with evidence that would later become the cornerstone of his legal challenge. Meanwhile, Kerren's tactics grew even more aggressive. In a series of curt, official letters, she warned that continued noncompliance would result in severe penalties, including the potential seizure of privately owned assets. The community began to feel the weight of these threats, and it was clear that if this abuse of power continued, no one would be safe from arbitrary interference. One particularly stormy night, as rain pounded on the barn roof and lightning streaked across the sky, Ethan reviewed his dossier one final time. The evidence was overwhelming, and he realized that the time had come to take his fight public. With a steely glint in his eye, he reached out to local journalists, handing over copies of the financial records, photographs, and recordings that detailed every instance of the HOA's abuses. Standing alone in the rain-soaked darkness outside his farmhouse, Ethan vowed that he would not allow Kerren and her cronies to trample on his legacy any longer. This battle was about far more than a few stolen eggs. It was about the right of every property owner to live freely and independently, without the overbearing shadow of arbitrary rules. The tension reached its apex one sweltering morning, when Ethan arrived at his ranch only to witness an act so outrageous that it compelled him to take dramatic action. As he walked along the fence line, he noticed a group of Kerren's HOA friends casually wandering through his chicken coop area, ignoring the no trespassing signs that Ethan had painstakingly put up. But the final insult came when he saw one of them collecting a basket of his freshly laid chicken eggs, as if they were free samples at a farmer's market. Enraged by this blatant disregard for his property, Ethan knew it was time to strike back. Rather than simply reporting the theft, he decided to exact his own brand of justice. With a wry plan forming in his mind, he gathered a basket of his best eggs and, later that morning, replaced them with a basket filled with rotten, foul-smelling eggs that had been left to decay in a corner of the barn. His idea was simple yet effective. Let nature take its course, and let the stench serve as a public message to those who dared to steal from him. Before dawn, as the roosters began to crow, Ethan quietly set his plan into motion. He carefully swapped out the freshly laid eggs with the rotten ones, ensuring that every stolen egg would be replaced by an unmistakable symbol of his defiance. Once the switch was complete, he resumed his daily routines, his eyes sharp with anticipation for the moment of reckoning. As the day wore on, Kerren and her entourage returned to the coop to inspect the property. When they reached the egg baskets, their faces twisted in confusion and disgust at the foul odor emanating from the rotten eggs. Kerren's usual composure faltered as she attempted to maintain her authority. "This is unacceptable," she exclaimed, waving her clipboard as if to dispel the stench. The HOA friends muttered among themselves, clearly unsettled by the unexpected turn of events. News of the egg swap spread quickly throughout Cedar Valley. Neighbors who had long suffered under the arbitrary enforcement of the HOA now found a spark of rebellion in Ethan's bold act. At the next HOA meeting, the atmosphere was electric with anticipation and secret smiles. Ethan walked into the meeting with a quiet confidence, a file of evidence under his arm, ready to expose the true nature of Kerren's abuses. "Ladies and gentlemen," Ethan began, addressing the packed room with a steady, measured tone, "I stand before you not merely as a victim of theft, but as a defender of property rights. My chickens lay these eggs as a result of years of hard work and care. When Kerren and her cronies steal them, they not only rob me of my livelihood, but also disrespect the traditions that bind us as a community." He then presented the evidence. Photographs of the swapped baskets, video footage of the HOA friends collecting the rotten eggs, and detailed logs of every incident of trespassing. The room fell silent as the evidence was laid out. Murmurs of approval and nods of solidarity rippled through the audience. For many, this was the spark they had been waiting for, a bold act of defiance that proved one man's right to protect his home. Kerren, standing at the back of the room, attempted to interject, insisting that the swapped eggs were an isolated incident and that she had only been trying to enforce community standards. But Ethan's words cut through the din. Community standards should never come at the expense of someone's hard work and dignity. My property is not a sandbox for your arbitrary rules. By the end of the meeting, the mood had shifted dramatically. The community support for Ethan was palpable, and even a few board members, previously loyal to Kerren, expressed their doubts about her methods. Ethan's bold countermeasure had transformed a personal grievance into a public crusade for justice. That evening, as Ethan walked along his fence with his dogs trotting at his side, he felt the weight of the day lift slightly. His ranch had suffered an injustice, but he had shown that he would not stand idly by. The rotten egg swap was not just a prank, it was a declaration of independence, a promise that nature itself would handle those who dared violate his rights. And as the sun set over Cedar Valley, Ethan vowed that he would continue to defend his property by any means necessary. As Ethan's defiant act of swapping out his stolen eggs with rotten ones spread like wildfire, Kerren found herself cornered and desperate to reassert her authority. In a final bid to salvage her reputation and maintain control over the community, she resolved to take one last extreme measure. Late one evening, under the cover of darkness, Kerren gathered a small group of loyal HOA enforcers and, armed with determination and a clipboard full of fabricated complaints, headed to Ethan's ranch with the intent of inspecting his property once more. This time, her plan was to catch Ethan off guard and intimidate him into compliance. As Kerren's group crept toward the chicken coop, they were unaware that Ethan had bolstered his security measures. High-definition cameras were now installed at every vulnerable entry point, and his dogs were on heightened alert. As the group neared the coop, a sudden loud alarm shattered the stillness of the night, a pre-programmed alert triggered by motion sensors Ethan had installed. Caught off guard, Kerren's enforcers froze momentarily. In that instant, one of Ethan's dogs sprang forward, barking ferociously and hurting the intruder's back. The security cameras captured every chaotic moment. Kerren, with a look of pure indignation, trying to regain control as her group scrambled in panic. The footage, later viewed in its entirety at the next HOA meeting, showed Kerren's face contorting with frustration and fear as the alarm blared and the intruders were forced to retreat. Her desperate attempt to intimidate had backfired, leaving her exposed as a bully resorting to underhanded tactics. The following day, at a specially convened HOA meeting held in the local community center, Ethan presented the security footage to a packed room of homeowners and board members. With calm resolve, he narrated the events of the previous night, emphasizing that his property was his own and that no one had the right to trespass, let alone try to intimidate him with false complaints and unauthorized inspections. This footage, Ethan said firmly as the video played, proves beyond a doubt that Kerren's tactics are not only overreaching, but also illegal. I will not allow my property or my rights to be violated, and I will take every legal step to hold her accountable. Kerren attempted to interject, claiming the incident was misunderstood and that she was merely enforcing community standards. But the room erupted in murmurs and sympathetic applause from those who had long suffered under her rule. The evidence was irrefutable. Kerren's final, desperate move had been a complete failure, further discrediting her authority. By the end of the meeting, it was clear that Kerren's days as the enforcer of arbitrary rules were numbered. The community was now united in its support for Ethan, and the legal ramifications of her actions loomed large. Her threats to reinspect or enforce compliance were met with a collective resolve to stand up for their rights. That night, as Ethan reviewed the damning footage one last time, he felt a mixture of sorrow for the ongoing conflict and satisfaction at the progress made. He knew that this evidence would serve as the cornerstone of further legal action, ensuring that Kerren would be held accountable for every act of trespass and intimidation. Kerren's final, desperate move had only deepened the community's resolve to reclaim their freedom, and Ethan's determination burned brighter than ever. In the wake of Kerren's exposed misdeeds and the overwhelming public outcry, the mood in Cedar Valley shifted dramatically. What had begun as a series of petty transgressions, stealing eggs and trespassing on private property, had evolved into a full-blown revolt against arbitrary power. Neighbors and homeowners, long subjected to Kerren's heavy-handed tactics, rallied together in protests, town hall meetings, and community forums demanding accountability and a return to respect for private property rights. At a particularly impassioned community meeting held at the local civic center, residents took turns recounting years of invasive inspections, unfair fines, and personal losses caused by the HOA's overreach. Stories of stolen chicken eggs, tampered livestock, and unauthorized access to private property filled the room with a palpable sense of injustice. As each testimony echoed through the hall, the collective determination to stand up against Kerren grew stronger. Under this mounting pressure, the HOA board, previously complicit in Kerren's authoritarian rule, found itself isolated. In a dramatic, historic vote broadcast live to the community, the board members, many of whom had grown disillusioned with Kerren's tactics, unanimously voted to remove her from her position as HOA president. The decision was met with thunderous applause, tears of relief, and a sense of vindication among the residents. For the first time in years, the community felt empowered to reclaim their rights. Simultaneously, local authorities announced an independent investigation into the HOA's practices. Auditors uncovered a tangled web of misappropriated funds, forged documents, and systematic abuses that had exploited property owners for far too long. Headlines in the local newspapers declared HOA tyranny overthrown and community rises against injustice, and the public rejoiced in the hope of a fairer future. For Ethan, the removal of Kerren was a deeply personal victory. His brave act of swapping his stolen chicken eggs with rotten ones had ignited a movement that not only reclaimed his property, but also set a powerful precedent for every homeowner in Cedar Valley. As he sat on his porch each evening, watching the sun set over his fields, Ethan felt an overwhelming sense of triumph, a vindication that his steadfast defense of his farm and his chickens had not been in vain. In the weeks that followed, the reformed HOA was established under new, democratically elected leadership committed to transparency, fairness, and respect for individual rights. Neighbors who had once lived in fear of arbitrary fines now spoke openly about their dreams for a future free from bureaucratic oppression. The oppressive rules and invasive practices were gradually dismantled, replaced by guidelines that valued community spirit without sacrificing personal freedom. As the golden light of dusk bathed Cedar Valley, the legacy of Kerren's tyrannical rule began to fade into memory. The community had reclaimed its dignity, and the battle for individual rights had been won. Ethan's ranch, though scarred by conflict, now stood as a proud symbol of resilience and the power of united voices. With the community united behind their cause, legal authorities moved swiftly to dismantle the corrupt structure of the old HOA. bolstered by Ethan's comprehensive dossier, which included high-definition security footage, photographs of unauthorized trespassing, and detailed records of every violation. The county launched an extensive investigation into the HOA's practices. The inquiry revealed a labyrinth of financial misappropriations, forged documents, and systematic abuses that had exploited property owners for years. A series of class action lawsuits was filed on behalf of the affected residents. In a landmark courtroom session, a judge pored over the indisputable evidence and issued a verdict that sent shockwaves through Cedar Valley. The HOA was to be dissolved immediately, its assets frozen pending further legal action, and its leadership held accountable for their crimes. The state attorney general even formed an independent task force to oversee the restructuring of neighborhood associations, ensuring that such abuses would never again take root. Local media exploded with the story. Headlines declared HOA tyranny dismantled and community triumph over corruption, while televised reports captured the jubilant reactions of residents who had long suffered under arbitrary fines and invasive inspections. Ethan's decisive actions, reporting Kerren for trespassing and preventing unauthorized egg theft, became a powerful symbol of resistance and accountability. The legal verdict was a resounding affirmation that no one was above the law, and that collective action could dismantle even the most entrenched systems of oppression. Former board members were subjected to intense scrutiny, and several were indicted on charges related to fraud and extortion. The dissolution of the old HOA marked not only the end of an era of fear, but the beginning of a new chapter built on transparency, fairness, and respect for individual rights. As the legal proceedings against the corrupt HOA reached their conclusion, Kerren Miller's personal world began to crumble in a series of humiliating reversals. Once the self-proclaimed enforcer of community standards, she was now exposed as a bully whose authority was based on intimidation and greed. Public scrutiny mounted as evidence of her repeated trespassing, and even the theft of chicken eggs was paraded in courtrooms and splashed across local media. Her bank accounts were frozen, and assets that had once symbolized her power were seized to cover fines and legal fees. In a final dramatic vote, the HOA board forced her resignation amid a storm of public outrage. Gossip spread rapidly throughout Cedar Valley. Neighbors whispered about her ruined reputation, and headlines chronicled her fall from grace. In a bitter twist of irony, Kerren was later forced to accept a low-level position as an assistant property manager for another HOA, a body that prided itself on strict adherence to the very rules she once exploited. One brisk morning, as Ethan drove past a modest office building where Kerren now worked in plain, unassuming attire, he couldn't help but smile and murmur under his breath, "I hope you like following the rules." That wry remark quickly became the talk of the town, a final, poetic mic drop on her once dominant reign. Interviews with former board members and previously intimidated residents painted a unanimous picture. Kerren's era of tyranny was over. Her personal collapse was not only a legal defeat, but also a public spectacle, a cautionary tale of unchecked power and arrogance. The community celebrated her downfall as a victory for individual rights and local autonomy. For Ethan, witnessing Kerren's ruin was deeply vindicating. His ranch, though scarred by months of conflict, now stood as a proud monument to resilience and the triumph of justice over oppression. Every stolen egg and every act of trespassing had been recorded and used to dismantle her reign. Kerren's fall had become a symbol of accountability, a reminder that no one is above the law. In the months following the dissolution of the corrupt HOA and Kerren's spectacular downfall, Cedar Valley began to heal. The oppressive shadow of arbitrary fines and invasive inspections slowly lifted, replaced by a renewed sense of community, unity, and empowerment. Ethan's ranch, secure and thriving under his careful stewardship, stood as a living testament to the power of resilience and the spirit of independence. At a celebratory community picnic held on a crisp autumn afternoon, neighbors gathered to mark the beginning of a new era, one defined by fairness, transparency, and respect for private property. Laughter echoed across open fields as families shared home-cooked meals and children played freely among the barns. In a light-hearted moment, A local artist unveiled a humorous mural depicting a red-faced Kerren surrounded by overturned egg baskets and speech bubbles that read, "Trespassers will be reported." A final, irreverent mic drop on her reign of terror. Seated on his porch with a steaming cup of coffee, Ethan watched the festivities with quiet satisfaction. The painful memories of stolen eggs and invasive trespassing had given way to hope and collective empowerment. When a longtime friend handed him a mock HOA violation notice for excessive egg theft, Ethan grinned and replied, "They really tried." In that serene moment, as the sun dipped below the horizon and bathed Cedar Valley in a warm golden glow, the legacy of Kerren's oppression faded into memory. The community had reclaimed its rights, and Ethan's steadfast defense of his ranch had become a powerful reminder that true power lies not in enforcing conformity, but in standing up for one's home and heritage. Fade to black.